Welcome back to the channel. I'm Matt, I'm a whiskey nerd, and this week I'm looking at a very special release from Athrú in Ireland. Like I said, this is a very special release from Athrú in Ireland. They're a new whiskey producer and this is a single cask release. So let me get it into the glass and I'll tell you a bit about it. Now, first off, what is a single cask? Essentially, it is what it sounds like. It is a whiskey that was released from a single cask. In this case, there are 292 bottles of whiskey that came from this single cask. That means that every whiskey in this range should taste exactly the same, but if you get different single cask releases, they're going to taste a little bit different. In this case, this is a 6-year-old single malt that spent its entire life in oloroso sherry casks. Now, if you're not familiar with oloroso sherry, it's a type of sherry which is very rich and very dense. It's known for being quite sweet, while also having some nice dried fruit notes, plenty of spice behind it as well. This particular whiskey comes in at 59.2% alcohol, so it's cask strength and it's got a whole lot of flavour behind it, so I expect those oloroso sherry notes to really come through in the whiskey and to be really present and really apparent. This is also the same whiskey that I put into this little mini whiskey cask, so if you haven't seen that video, check it out, there'll be a link up there. But in the meantime, I think I'm going to look at this whiskey, I'm going to get to know this whiskey, see how it tastes, how it evolves, and then later on, when I taste the whiskey when it comes out here, I'll be able to really compare and contrast the original whiskey and its supercharged version. So that's enough talking about the whiskey, let's get to it. Let's go in for the nose. The nose on this, it's dense and syrupy. It's kind of if you imagine a caramel, it smells quite like a caramel, like the kind of syrupy caramel, but then if you mix that with a honey, so it's a little bit looser, it's a little bit richer and kind of thicker, so it's got really nice, dense sweetness right up front, and then behind that, that's where you get the spice, that's where you get those kind of dried fruits, those kind of nutmeggy, cinnamon, clove, those kind of spices. You're very much apparent in an oloroso sherry, they're very apparent here. There's a lot of kind of dried fruits notes coming through, so if you imagine like those dried raisins, those kind of dried fruits you get with like a Christmas cake, those are very apparent here. There's not a huge amount of nuttiness. Now normally I'd associate kind of almonds or maybe walnuts with an oloroso sherry. I'm not getting a huge amount of that coming through here. Maybe a little bit of like walnut skin, like that kind of nice kind of dry walnut skin, but not a huge amount coming through. Also, one thing I will note is very little ABV here. Now it is 59.2% alcohol, but on the nose, for me at least, there's very little alcohol present. It's very nice and approachable. It almost feels like it's a whiskey that's lower alcohol, but it's still so full of flavour. So let's go in for the palate. Okay, here the ABV, it kind of makes itself known. There's a nice heat on it. There's a nice heat that kind of spreads across your tongue. Again, that dense, syrupy kind of sweetness, that dense mouthfeel, that's very apparent here. But in terms of the ABV, it is much more apparent up front that this is a cask strength whiskey, not in a bad way. I quite like that heat. I quite like knowing that there's a bit of oomph behind the whiskey. So it's very nice, but maybe just for your first sip, you're going to notice a bit more of the alcohol, so maybe when you go back in again, you're going to notice more of those spices. So I'm going to go in again, I'm going to see what I can find. Okay, this time around I was going to be able to get so much more of those dried fruits, those kind of nuttiness notes. That's very apparent. Like I said, in the nose, I was getting a little bit of a walnut skin. Here I'm getting like I've just chewed a walnut. It's very rich. It's very dense, very apparent. There's a lot more of those dried fruits notes coming through. There's as well some of those spice and some of those sweetness. It's very well balanced. Like it's very thick and rich and kind of juicy. It's a very, very nice whiskey. The ABV, it was apparent up front, but then once you kind of sit with it a little bit, that sweetness, I think it just overtakes the ABV. It really does hide it. It is a whiskey, I think, where the alcohol is hidden quite well by all the other flavors that are kind of competing against it. I mean, it's so rich and so dense, like there's a lot to unpack here. I mean, it is only aged in oloroso sherry casks, so you're not going to get a huge evolution between like a bourbon barrel and into an oloroso sherry cask. So you're not going to get a huge evolution, but what there is, there's a lot of flavor there of those oloroso sherry notes. So I'm going to go in again, but I'm going to look at what I can find and finish. Okay. As that ABV kind of fades, like I said, the sweetness and that spice overtake the ABV. As I'm letting that kind of whiskey fade away, as I'm letting those notes kind of dissipate out, I'm left with the spice definitely, the sweetness definitely, and the ABV is making a little bit more of a reappearance. Now, I say reappearance, it's more about the heat. Like that heat on my tongue is very there, it's very noticeable. Not in a bad way, again, it's just more of a warming sensation. I can feel it warming all the way down my chest. Like there's a nice bit of heat behind this whiskey, there's a nice bit of flavour behind it too. If you've seen the video where we fill up that little mini cask, you might have heard Rose describe this as being like maple syrup on pancakes, and I can definitely see why she says that. There's lots of sweetness here, there's a lot of dense, kind of spicy, sweet notes. Whenever I taste this whiskey, I think of a Christmas cake. I think of like a Christmas pudding that's just maybe had a little bit of sherry put on top of it, a little bit of flame on it, really nice, really dense, rich, kind of Christmassy flavors, and that's really nice here. One thing to note about Athrú is that they've only recently started producing their own whiskey. This is all sourced whiskey that they're using. So it's not their own whiskey, but based on the care that went into it, the attention to detail, like from the visuals of the bottle all the way through to the actual whiskey within the bottle, like that's really nice, rich whiskey. I can think it speaks to the quality of the whiskey that we might expect coming out from them once they've got their own stock aged, once they've got their own barrels matured, and once they can kind of play around with the whiskey themselves. I think the whiskey they're putting out now shows where they intend to go, so I for one am very much excited to see what they do next. And that's where I might leave this review. I mean, it's a very nice whiskey. There's only 292 bottles of it around, so if you want to try it out, you have to act quick. You have to get onto their website and try it out for yourself. But in the meantime, I'm going to keep on enjoying this. I'm going to keep on sipping this. And I'll see you next time. Sláinte.